Welcome to our next lecture of research methods, intro to research methods. Okay, today we're talking about chapter 3. In this video, we're going to talk about chapter 3. It's going to be the first part of our lecture on research ethics. So let's get started. Okay, first a little introduction here. Should psychologists use deception or attempt to produce certain feelings in their research participants? Should psychologists do that? Should we lie to people? Should we deceive people or try to produce certain feelings in them? Maybe feelings that they rather we not produce in them. In this chapter, we're going to talk about the ethics of that, okay? We discussed the ethics of research. What exactly is and is not allowed? Should we do those things? Should we deceive participants? Should we cause certain feelings in them that may be uncomfortable? And we're also going to review the mechanisms designed to safeguard the individuals who take part in research. Research, if it's not done the right way, can be harmful. So we're going to talk about safeguards that are put in place to minimize that harm. Okay, let's continue then. So what is research ethics? Research ethics, it is the responsibility of researchers to be honest and respectful to all individuals who are affected by the research studies, or their report of the study's results. So as researchers, we have a responsibility to treat our participants right, to be honest with them, to be respectful, to treat them right, in other words, okay? Not just those individuals, but also those who are affected by the results of the study. Those others that are out there that are part of the population. We want to do a study that's worthwhile, that is honest, it's accurate, we treat participants correctly, and then it really says something. We can really generalize about what's happening out there. So we want to be respectful, not just to those who participate in the study, but to those whom the results apply to. The ethics for psychology are guided by the American Psychological Association's ethical principles for research. We're going to talk about what those are later on, okay? And just a question over here, just to make you guys think, what is the difference between research ethics and morality? Given that I'm recording this, and this is a video lecture, and I asked you to save your questions until the end, well, I guess I'll just have to answer that myself, okay? There is a difference between ethics and morality. You see, research ethics are the guidelines, basically, that we need to follow in order to do our, our research ethically. In other words, it's the rules about what is and is not allowed. Those are the ethics, okay? Morality is something different. Morality has to do with what you think is right or wrong. And it may not be the same thing. I'll give you an example. It is ethical, according to the guidelines of the American Psychological Association, to do research on animals, as long as it's done in a certain way that minimizes harm, that minimizes suffering. It is ethical. But to a lot of you, that's probably not moral. It's probably not right. So there's a difference between ethics and morality. What is ethical is basically what is allowed legally. What is moral is something else, and you might have higher standards for morality. Let's keep going. There are ethical concerns throughout the research process, okay? For each study, we must determine a bunch of different things. We must determine what measurement techniques may be used. What are we going to use to measure things? And ethical questions will come up there. For instance, if you're doing a study that involves alcohol, how much alcohol do you give participants? Okay, you don't want to harm them necessarily or minimize the harm. Okay, you want to minimize the harm. So, how should you measure things? How much do you give participants? How much of the independent variable do you expose participants to? There are all kinds of ethical issues that come up. I'll give you another example. There are studies that have to do with sexual behavior. Well, how do you measure whatever the variables are? How do you do that ethically? So you treat your participants right and you don't do something that's very invasive or perverted or something like that. So these ethical concerns are going to come up throughout the study. In our measurement techniques, how we select participants, what's ethical there? You know, if you're talking about where you're studying some life-saving drug, for instance, who should be a part of that study and who should be left out? There's probably going to be some people who are desperate to participate. How do you select those participants? Which research strategies to use? Okay, and what kind of design are you going to use? You need to think about that. What is the best approach? Okay, should you, for instance, do an experiment? Should you do an observation, survey? What's the best way to handle this? What is a way in which you can handle this in which you're going to minimize harm to participants? Okay, and you know, how to carry out the study. You know, what are you going to do from beginning to end? Concerns will come up throughout the study. How to analyze the data. That's part of being ethical. You have to be honest, you know, with the data. You have to analyze it correctly. You have to report it correctly. All these are ethical concerns. All ethical concerns will come out throughout the whole process of doing research. So it's always something that we have to worry about. Make sure we're doing things right. We're treating our participants correctly. Let's keep going. There's two basic categories of research design. Okay. Two basic categories of research design. Okay. So two basic categories when it comes to ethics. Okay. One is that we need to ensure the welfare and dignity of participants / subjects. We don't really call participants subjects anymore. If we're talking about human participants, they're called participants. In the past, we called them subjects, right? Like they were subjected to something. But now they're called participants because, you know, it's their choice to participate or not. We don't force them. Now, there are subjects when it comes to research. Okay, there are animals used in research, and those would be subjects, okay? If they had a choice, they probably would not participate. So we don't call them participants, we call them subjects. So we need to ensure the welfare and dignity of these participants or these subjects. We need to treat people right. We need to, you know, minimize harm. Even if we're dealing with subjects like basically animals in research, we need to minimize harm as most, you know, the most we can. And there also has to be accuracy in reporting the research results. We have to be honest, okay, and not commit fraud and things like that. That's all part of ethical research. You have to keep in mind that researchers are in a position of control over these participants. When they come in for a study, we're in a position of control. And we have no right to abuse this power. We have no right to mistreat participants or take advantage of them in any way. No right to mistreat them in any way, okay? Not psychologically, emotionally, physically, or in any way. We have to follow ethical guidelines, and we have to treat them respectfully, minimize harm. We'll talk about what's involved with these ethical guidelines in a bit. But yes, we're in a position of power, position of control. The participants are trusting us that we're going to do the right thing, and we have to follow these ethical guidelines. What about if you know, participants? What if the researchers do not follow the guidelines? What is in place to hold researchers accountable? Okay, well, there's several things actually. One is the Institutional Review Board, which reviews human experimental research. There's the Institutional Animal Care and Use Committee. Yes, there is a committee that basically reviews research that deals with non-human subjects. In other words, that reviews research involving animals. And there's several others, okay, which we'll mention in a bit, but there's that, you know, there are, you know, basically committees at the institutional level, at the subject level, like American Psychological Association's guidelines. There is also things in place at the state level, at the federal level. So there's several safeguards in place. And reporting of research is assumed to be ethical, accurate, honest, and valid. Okay, it's assumed that that will be the case. And there's actually, before something gets published, there's actually a group of people, a committee, who reviews the research to make sure that it is accurate, honest, and valid. Let's keep going. Ethical research and human participants in research, okay? Ethical issues and human participants in research. So, you know, these ethical guidelines didn't come out of nowhere, okay? There are reasons why they exist. So we're gonna talk about some of the major historical events that help shape the current guidelines, okay? And we're gonna talk about also the major elements of the APA ethical guidelines concerning research with human participants. Eventually, we'll get to the guidelines for, the APA guidelines for animal research. But first, we'll start with the guidelines for human participants. And we'll talk about the purposes and responsibilities of the Institutional Review Board. One of the committees, one of the things in place designed to basically, you know, to enforce these guidelines. Let's keep going. So let's talk first about these historical highlights. What led to the development of these ethical guidelines? Well, the thing is that, you know, scientists, researchers have done some very questionable, even some horrible things in the past. Guidelines haven't always existed. So because scientists, researchers basically did questionable or horrible things in the past, well, people were shocked by that, they were offended, they were horrified by that, and that led basically to the development of these guidelines. Give you some examples, some of the horrible things that have happened in the past. The Nazi medical experiments during World War II. You see, the Nazis didn't just kill a bunch of people. They also experimented on them, and they did some horrible, horrible experiments. Things that you wouldn't think people are, you know, people are capable of. Okay, some horrible things. I'll just give you one example just to highlight how horrible this was. Okay, for instance, in one experiment, they wanted to determine how many blows to the head the skull can take before it breaks. That is a horrible thing to do, but they did things like that. They did horrible medical experiments. They're just horrible experiments that shocked and horrified people after they found out what was really going on. They didn't just kill people, they tortured people, they did experiments on them. So these atrocities committed, you know, in Nazi Germany actually led to war crime trials. After the war was over and the Nazis lost, they tried to put some of them on trial. Some of these generals, some of these military leaders. You know, some people were never put on trial, but they put them on trial. And of course, a lot of their defense will boil down to, well, I was just following orders. Okay, I was just doing what I was told. That was the excuse of a lot of them. But these trials shed light on a lot of the horrible things that were happening at the time. And that basically led to, you know, laws that were passed, guidelines that were given for basically doing research in the right way. So it has a horrible start, these guidelines basically. I mean, not a horrible start, but a history that's really horrible and shocking. That's where it comes from. That's what happens with a lot of things. We do some things, they're horrible, people are shocked, and then they demand that things change. They demand that laws are put in place and guidelines are put in place that people have to follow from then on. Those Nazi war crime trials led to what's called the Nuremberg Code in 1947 that established some guidelines for research, for ethical research. And here are some of those guidelines. Voluntary consent. For one thing, participants need to consent to be in any kind of experiment, to be a part of any research. The research has to be fruitful and worthwhile. It could just be, it can't be something that you do just out of curiosity, okay? There must be some reason for doing it. It must possibly lead to something that would really benefit us to know. Prior knowledge and justification, you have to know something about what might happen, and you have to know basically why you would even want to do something like that. You're not allowed to harm participants, or you have to minimize that harm. So you're not allowed to harm participants. Okay, that was another thing. You have to minimize the risk to participants. Try to minimize the risk as much as you can. Sometimes maybe a little harm is inevitable, but you have to try to minimize that as much as you can. You have to have qualified researchers. You can't just have anybody doing the work. People who don't know what they're talking about, or people who just don't know how to do the research. That can lead to some really bad things happening, okay? That can lead to harm that could have been prevented. And participants have the right to withdraw at any time that they want. So these, the Nuremberg Code established some guidelines that were put in place, at the time. And then that led to other things. There was also the Declaration of Helsinki in 1946 that provided similar international ethics guidelines for medical research. So first there was the Nuremberg Code that came out of the Nazi war crime trials. And then there was the Declaration of Helsinki. Actually, the Declaration of Helsinki seems to predate the Nuremberg Code. The Nazi trials, this trial started before the Declaration of Helsinki, but there's a couple of things that came out of some of those horrible things that the Nazis were doing. Now, I don't know if you can see all of this, but here's more information about some of these guidelines in the Nuremberg Code. I'm not going to read them, but they're there for you guys when you download the PowerPoint if you want to take a closer look at them, because we just provided some highlights. Okay. And the reason I'm not going to go over it in detail now is because a lot of these things in the Nuremberg Code are actually also part of the APA guidelines. And we'll talk about them more, we'll talk about the APA guidelines more specifically. Other historical highlights that led to the the updating and the changing of some of these guidelines. There was the Milgram's Obedience Study in the National Research Act. So the Milgram's Obedience Study, a lot of you may have heard about this. The Milgram Obedience Study sought to discover how far subjects would go in order to obey an authority figure. So if you've heard about it, you might remember that Milgram did a study in which he had participants shock somebody, supposedly another subject, Milgram basically did a study in which he basically told participants to shock an individual who had a heart condition. And Milgram wanted to know how far subjects would go in potentially harming this person or potentially killing this person. Now, I should say that there was deception in this study. The person who supposedly had a heart condition was actually part of the study and was actually faking it. But Milgram wanted to discover how far participants would go when it comes to obeying orders. Would they hurt someone? Would they potentially kill someone? And this is an idea that basically came from what happened during Nazi Germany. Because like I said, a lot of these war criminals that were put on trial, their defense was, I was just following orders. Milgram wanted to know if people were likely to follow orders where you would potentially kill someone or harm someone or do horrible things to someone. So that's why he did that study. Now, while the person who was pretending to be shocked or pretending to have a heart condition wasn't really harmed, the participants who were basically told that they had to, follow the orders of the experimenter, were potentially harmed. They did things that they were very uncomfortable doing. And participants were probably harmed in that case. That happened in 1963. And that led, of course, to strengthening of guidelines. The US Surgeon General in the late 1960s ordered all federally funded research proposals from the Public Health Service to be reviewed for ethical treatment of subjects. And the National Research Act in 1974 mandated regulation for protection of subjects. So in the late 60s, the Surgeon General said that, okay, all research that receives money from the federal government has to be reviewed for ethical treatment of subjects or ethical treatment of participants. It has to be reviewed to, make sure that ethical guidelines are being followed. And the National Research Act then mandated regulations and protections, other regulations and protections for subjects. Other historical highlights, the Tuskegee Study and the Belmont Report. The Tuskegee Study was a study that was done between 1932 and 1972. It was a medical study that did some horrible things. The researchers in this case, the medical researchers, withheld penicillin from participants that were suffering from syphilis, even after it became the standard treatment. So they knew, the researchers knew that penicillin could be used to treat syphilis, but they withheld penicillin from research participants without their knowledge, so they could examine the final stages of the disease. In other words, they let participants suffer and then die, okay, just so they can see what syphilis does to people at the end. And by the way, who this was done to, the participants who were denied the penicillin that could have cured them, they were Black participants. And there's also the Belmont Report, 1970. The Belmont Report, 1979, identified 3 basic ethical principles for protection of human subjects. So the Belmont Report was something that was passed in 1979. It said that basically, when it comes to doing research with humans, you need to have consent. So participants need to agree that they want to participate. You're not allowed to harm participants. And when it comes to selecting participants, you have to select participants for research fairly. That's especially important when you have a medical research study, let's say where they maybe are testing whether penicillin can be useful for treating syphilis. Well, you have to be fair in selecting participants. You're not allowed to deny them treatment that would otherwise help them. Let's keep going, okay? Eventually, the APA, the American Psychological Association's guidelines were proposed. And these APA guidelines are ethical guidelines for use and treatment of human participants in research. So eventually we got guidelines from the American Psychological Association. These are the first set of guidelines for protecting human subjects in 1973. That's when they were passed. So the Milgram study was done before that. The guidelines did not exist. And participants were harmed. There's other studies that were done before these guidelines were passed. Some of you have heard of the study done on the participant known as Little Albert. Okay, that horrible study that they did on basically an infant to try to to see if fear is learned, and they did some horrible things with Little Albert. So all kinds of things were done before this that in which participants were not treated right and were harmed. So finally, we got some guidelines in 1973. The guidelines, I should say, are updated and expanded many times and periodically reviewed. So the guidelines have to change because as we do more and more research, things go wrong sometimes, or things don't go as we expect. So we have to often update the guidelines, strengthen them so that they are still current and they still work. I'll give you an example. In the past, it was okay to shock participants. It was considered okay to use electric shock. It was believed that, okay, well, it's a little painful. It's not really harming them that much. It's no big deal, and it was allowed. Nowadays, you're not allowed to shock participants at all. It's just not allowed. Okay? So researchers have to kind of try to work within the confines of these guidelines. They're updated, they're strengthened, and you know, as we learn more and more. And it becomes tougher and tougher to meet these guidelines. There are guidelines in, you know, in all areas, you know, whether, even if you're talking about the manufacture of like automobiles, there are guidelines there. In the past, it was okay that automobiles didn't have crumple zones, didn't have seat belts or airbags and things like that. And as we learn more and more about how to protect people, then we mandate certain, you know, certain things, and we mandate that there should be airbags, that there should be seat belts, and there should be crumple zones in cars to protect people. Well, the APA guidelines are updated, reviewed periodically to make sure that we are still protecting participants adequately. And of course, we learn, you know, as time passes by, there's always things that could be better. Nothing is perfect. So the guidelines are updated, we strengthen them, so we can be even better at protecting participants. Now, what are these guidelines? What do these guidelines actually cover? So there's actually 10 ethical standards to provide guidance for psychologists. There's 10 of them, 10 guidelines. One is no harm, not allowed to harm participants in any way. Another one has to do with privacy. And another one with confidentiality. You need institutional approval. Research has to be done by individuals who are competent. There's guidelines that concern record keeping and informed consent. When you can dispense with informed consent. In other words, when informed consent is not needed. And there are guidelines that have to do with inducements, deception, and debriefing. There are 10 ethical standards, and they have to do with those things. And I'll show you what the 10 are in a moment. This is just a list here. So we'll talk about those things. See table 4.2 and the APA website for more information. So I don't know if you guys can see this, but here are some of the guidelines. First one there says that no harm. You're not allowed to harm participants in any way. Okay, and that's something that should be obvious. You're not allowed to do that. And these are guidelines for human participants. Okay, you're not allowed to harm them. Now the guidelines for animals in research, those will be different. Okay, in that case, harm is allowed. But with humans, you're not allowed to harm them in any way. Privacy and confidentiality, I'll just summarize some of these things for you because, you know, not gonna read it. That'll take too much time. Privacy and confidentiality, yeah, you have to, you should not collect information about participants that can be used to identify them. Okay, so information you collect should be kept private, confidential. There shouldn't be a way to link that with the participant who was studied. There should be no social security numbers, no names, or anything like that collected. If information like that is collected, let's say for medical purposes or something like that, then they need to link that with some kind of code. And the code is then linked to the information that was collected, but not the identifying information. So participants have a right to privacy and confidentiality. Institutional approval, okay, all research, all psychological research needs to be approved. There needs to be a committee at the institution where the research is done that reviews the research. There's a proposal that is written. The researchers basically have to write a proposal that outlines what they plan to do and what they hope it's going to show and what they think is going to happen. And they have to write this proposal and explain how they're minimizing risk and what participants can expect from participating in this study. And there's a group of people whose job it is to look at these proposals and determine, is this something that should be allowed or is this something that should not be allowed? Should we send it back? Should we just disapprove of it and say, no, you can't do this? Or should we say, okay, well, you need to make some changes here before we can approve it? There's a group of people who does that, who is responsible for approving psychological research. Competence, okay? So yeah, you need to have individuals who are trained in how to do this research. You need to be competent. You can't just have just anybody doing the research. Just like when you go to the hospital, you expect that the person who's giving you an injection or who's doing surgery on you has actually been trained and is competent. Same thing with doing research, okay? Psychological research. The individuals who are doing the research have to be trained. They have to know what they're doing. Otherwise, they could harm participants. Record keeping, okay, yes, records have to be kept in a place where not just anybody can find them, so they have to be kept on their lock and key. It used to be in the past that things were kept in a, in paper form, and you kept them in a file cabinet that was locked. Nowadays, everything's electronic, and things are saved on a hard drive. And well, there has to be safeguards in place to make sure that not just anybody can access that information. It has to be password protected. There has to be things in place to make sure that people can't just go in there and start looking at that data. People who are not part of the research, people who have no business doing that. Informed consent. Participants need to, so number 6 there, participants need to consent. They need to agree to participate in the research. And it's not just that they need to agree to participate in the research, they have to know what they're getting into. It's not just consent, it has to be informed consent. So participants need to understand what they're getting into. So there's a consent form that is developed that explains to participants what is going to be happening during the research. And they read that, and at the bottom, there's a place where they sign and date. So in other words, they know what they're getting into, they know what they're agreeing to. And there's a bunch of things there that have to do with informed consent that I'll cover more carefully in a little bit. Informed consent is one of the biggest things about this APA guidance, one of the most important things. We'll cover that in more detail. I'll just summarize there a little bit. Dispensing with informed consent. When informed consent is not needed, there are in some cases where participants don't need to consent. They don't need to agree to be a part of the research. That might sound odd, but there are times when it's not needed. Like for instance, when you're doing an observation, you are doing a naturalistic observation. You should not be interfering with participants. And in that case, you're observing them from a distance. It's in public, and you don't need to ask them for permission to observe them. If you do ask them, then the observation is not going to work. So there are some cases where informed consent is not needed. Offering inducements for research. Sometimes inducements have to do with things that are used to motivate people to participate in research. So for instance, there might be like, say, payment for participating in research, or some kind of reward, some kind of benefit. There are certain things that are allowed and certain things that are not allowed. You're not allowed, for instance, to offer such a big monetary reward for participating in research that participants will do it out of desperation because they really want the money, something like that, okay? Where participants will subject themselves, like, potentially to harm just because they need the money. So in other words, the inducements cannot be unreasonable to the extent that you are basically, in giving such a large inducement, you are coercing participants in a way, forcing them because it's so much money that you're offering for participation in that research. Deception in research, when it is okay and when it's not okay to deceive participants, to withhold information, or maybe to lie to them. Sometimes it's allowed, sometimes it's not allowed. We'll talk about how that is the case. Debriefing, okay? Debriefing has to do with telling participants about the study after it's over. So after the study is over, you sit down with them and you tell them, okay, this is what we did and this is why we did it. And you basically, if there was any deception involved or anything that made participants feel uncomfortable, you explain why you did it, and you sort of put them at ease and reassure them that you had their best interest at heart, basically. Sometimes you don't really need to sit down and talk with them. Sometimes you could just provide a little statement, you know, a little pre-written statement. This is why we did this. It's something that maybe you could do, maybe if you're doing just a survey where you ask them some questions, And then in the end, there's a little statement that's, after they turn in actually the survey, you might give them a little statement and say, read this, you know, thank you for your participation, just read this. And it just tells them, all right, we did a study about this, and you know, this is why we did it. So debriefing is sometimes detailed and complicated. Not complicated, but sometimes it's a very important part of the study, like in an experiment. And sometimes it's just a little minor thing where you just give them a little statement. But debriefing is more important for some studies than others, what I'm saying. It is important that you have some debriefing there, but it's in some studies it's critical, in others it's not a big deal. How are we doing? Okay. Okay, so like I said, those are the guidelines. Here they are. I summarized them, and here they are. Again, here in bigger font for you guys, some of those highlights that I summarized. So here it is. So no harm, that's one of the guidelines, item 1, table 4.2. Okay, so subjects must be protected from physical or psychological harm. Okay, you're not allowed to harm participants. That's one of the guidelines that I mentioned. Clinical equipoise is something related to that, right? Clinicians need to provide the best possible treatment. Studies that compare inferior treatments may violate the principle of no harm. So what if you're studying participants, for instance, what if you're studying a treatment, for instance, that might be beneficial and might ease participants' suffering, let's say, someone who's suffering for something, maybe has some disease, some condition, and you knowingly put them in the control group or in the placebo group. You are denying some treatment that could be beneficial, and that violates the principle of no harm. If you know the treatment is beneficial, you're not really allowed to withhold it from participants. So medical researchers have to be mindful of this, that they're not allowed to knowingly withhold basically medicine or treatment that could be beneficial. Zimbardo study, there are several studies that violate the principle of no harm. The Zimbardo study was one of those. Some of you have heard about the Zimbardo study, but what happened there is that subjects, or participants, I should say, adopted the role of a prisoner or guard. So some participants were assigned to be prisoners, and some of them were assigned to be guards. And they did this basically simulation in which they wanted to know what it was like. Okay, what happens like in prisons. So some participants, so they created a mock prison, a fake prison, and they had some participants assigned to be prisoners and some assigned to be guards. And they gave them certain, certain guidelines about what they can do, what they're allowed to do. And then they let the study run. And what happened there is that after a while, the prisoners basically started abusing the guards, started treating them really horribly, just like what happens in a real prison. The study got too real, for instance. That's what happened. And the study had to be ended prematurely because of the subject's behavior. The guards were actually abusing the guards, not physically, but psychologically and mentally. They were treating them horribly. There's a link there to the Zimbardo prison study, if you're interested in that. I'll see if I can find a way to show it to you guys. We're having a little bit of trouble with Zoom here, but I'll see if I can find a way to do that. Other ethical issues. So I'm pointing out some of the more important ones. I summarized the guidelines there that are written in detail there in that table, but there's some that we need to touch upon more specifically, more closely. Deception. I talked about deception. When is it allowed and when is it not allowed? Sometimes it's allowed and sometimes it's not, okay? Deception may be allowed and comes in two forms. It's allowed in some cases. Passive deception is when you omit information about the study. So in other words, you leave certain things out. Let's say that there's a surprise memory test. You didn't mention that, but it comes up in the study. You didn't tell them that something was going to happen, and then it shows up in the study. So that's passive deception. When you willingly omit information, you just don't tell them something. Something's going to happen and you don't tell them. Because if you tell them, it would ruin the study. That's passive deception. There's also active deception, where you present false or misleading information. Active deception is basically when you just lie to them, okay? You tell them the study, for instance, is about aggression. Actually, you don't tell them the study is about aggression. The study is about aggression, but you tell them it's about competition. We're interested in competition, but the study is really about aggressive behavior. So there, that's called active deception. You're actually lying to them. And you're lying to them because you don't want them to know the study's about aggressive behavior. Otherwise, it won't work. Participants don't want to knowingly behave aggressively. They don't want you to see them that way. So if you tell them it's about aggressive behavior, they won't behave aggressively. So you tell them instead it's about competition, and they're going to be competing with each other, and then you might see their real aggression. But that is active deception, where you willingly lie to them. You present false or misleading information. More about deception. Deception is a bit of a touchy subject, okay? It's something that is a bit controversial, because deception compromises informed consent. If you, let's say, lie to participants, or you omit information about the study, when participants agree to participate, when they sign that consent form, do they really know what they're getting into? Is it really informed consent? They are consenting, but are they really informed? That's an issue, right? That is often debated. The deception must be justified, okay? If you do use deception, it must be justified. The benefits must outweigh the cost. So the benefits that you get from lying to participants, let's say you tell them the study is really about competition, and you don't tell them it's about aggression. Okay, what you can potentially gain from that should be useful enough so that it outweighs this lie that you're telling them. You can't just deceive them or lie to them for something that is not worthwhile. There must be a good reason why you do that. In other words, what you gain must outweigh the deception. You cannot conceal information about physical pain or severe emotional distress. You're not allowed to do that, okay? If there's gonna be potentially some physical pain, some emotional distress, you must tell them that they may feel uncomfortable. You must tell them about those risks. For instance, I did some research on aggressive behavior. When I was in graduate school, I had to tell participants that they might be consuming alcohol. Some of them did, some of them did not. I told them they might be consuming alcohol, and that, for instance, there may be some discomfort because of that. So I couldn't omit that information from them. And if there is deception, debriefing must occur as soon as possible. After the study is over, the experiment is over, if you deceive participants, if you lie to them or omitted information, you have to sit down with them afterward and tell them what you really did and why you did it. Why it was important that you do that, to sort of reassure them, put them at ease, that you still had their best interest at heart. Okay, we will have to stop there.